Okay, hello everyone, and good evening. I just wanted to start with a quick chazara on the previous sugya, or the previous topic. It's really all one sugya. The issue of makeh b'patish, particularly because I think when we did it last time, I accidentally had not sent the me'iri, for which I apologize. So the basic topic of makeh b'patish is Rashi's comment that there isn't makeh b'patish in the case of Chavisa, only in the case of Tanura, and Rashi says that the final act of baking in the kiln, this chovis, this pot in the kiln, doesn't count as a makeh b'patish because me'eleo nigmar, it's finished by itself rather than being finished through an action. And the Minchas Chinuch, which we referenced, understands that the explanation is that the chiddush of a melacha of baking is that even though it happens by itself, I merely put it in the oven and then the oven bakes it. Nonetheless, I'm chayiv for the melacha. This is a chiddush in ofen mavashal and perhaps some other melachas also, where this is the way to do the melacha. The way to do the melacha is to put it in the oven and then the oven bakes it. Whereas makeh b'patish needs my active engagement. We don't have this chiddush with makeh b'patish that putting it in the oven is enough to make it the melacha. And the Minchas Chinuch also assumes that this is the same answer when it comes to every time I bake a cake or a loaf. Why is it not also b'makeh b'patish? And he understands that that's the answer, against the view of the Biur Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah, who holds that makeh b'patish is not a concept that makes sense with oichlim in that form. This was one svara. A second explanation of why there's no makeh b'patish here is the me'iri, which I now updated the source sheet and I sent. I don't know if anyone's since had a chance to look at the me'iri and has a different way of understanding it, but it seems to me that what the me'iri is saying is that makeh b'patish is only when there's a specific action, unique and different to the previous actions, which finishes off the melacha, finishes off the utensil, completes it. However, if I'm merely just doing a continuum of continued activities until I finish it off, that's not makeh b'patish. It's just 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, and they all add up together to make the utensil. There isn't a finishing act. It's only when there's a unique and specific finishing act that it counts as makeh b'patish. And the third answer given as a possible resolution to the contradiction that the Lechem Mishnah raises in the Rambam, in which the Rambam seems to consider that both makeh b'patish and bona would be relevant in the case of where I drill these holes in the sides of the chicken coop, the lul shel tarnagolim. It's both bona and makeh b'patish, and yet the Rambam seems to say you're only chayav for one. Is that by definition, when it's another melacha, it's not makeh b'patish. Makeh b'patish is where the whole chashivas, the whole significance of the teitzah, of the result that I'm creating, is just that I'm completing it. But if there's a different significance because it's another melacha, then that's the significance of the activity. That's what it means for it to be another melacha, and therefore I wouldn't be chayav for makeh b'patish. So I think that's a summary of what I said last time, and I hope that sort of leaves this topic reasonably clear. Before I go further, does anyone want to raise anything about makeh b'patish?
Can I just clarify that in the me'iri? Because I'd understood the me'iri to say, if there is a melacha and the melacha is complete, and then some additional thing occurs, that additional thing is the makeh b'patish, and there has to be a complete melacha, some other melacha completed first before you can get to makeh b'patish. That's how I'd understood it, but maybe I misunderstood.
I don't think that's what he means, because if it was complete before the makeh b'patish, then that begs the question: if it's complete before makeh b'patish, why is that final act not makeh b'patish itself? So I think he's saying,
well, it's a bit like these strands. These strands, extra strands on the coat, on the garment. So the garment is complete. The melacha of oreg is complete, and then there's these extra strands, and for somebody who's makbid on that, so he's going to make him, that's the liability for makeh b'patish. But otherwise everything is complete in the there's a melacha, and a melacha which has been completed. And then you have a liability, there's some prior liability on a completed melacha, and then if there's something additional happening, then it's going to be makeh b'patish.
In other words, you've already got a functionality, and now you're adding on an addition, which gives it an extra or additional function.
Yes.
The difficulty I had in that reading is, why should there be a difference? Why isn't it makeh b'patish then if I take something from 0 to 1? In other words, if I give it a functionality, why would that not be makeh b'patish? in the same way as adding a new functionality is
Well,
makabel
I mean, the
patich.
Meiri, when he talks about the last letter of the book, etc., the sefer, or the last ariga, the last stitch in the garment, he doesn't then mention makabel patish at all. He's just saying, how do you become, my chiddush here is, even though you've only done one letter, because it's such a chashuv letter, because it's the end of the sefer, you're liable. But you're liable to ketiva, for ketiva, you're not liable for makabel
So
patish.
that's really the Gemara. The Gemara says that you're chayiv there for one letter, the last letter of the book. But the Meiri then asks, why is there not, or quotes the question that's asked, why is there not makabel patish there?
He asked that question. I didn't.
Yeah, that's the question he brings in the name of
I didn't.
Chachmi Adoros shown him.
But no, that's the question on the Glima. I thought he would say.
But it's a question also. It's a question also in the Gemara itself that says that you're chayiv for writing the last ois in a. It's the Gemara really that says if you write one letter in a book.
Then he says that letter. Sorry, he's saying you're not going to be liable for makabel patish.
Correct. Yes, that's what he's medayik from the Gemara.
Right,
The Gemara says you're chayiv for writing, but not for makabel patish.
Yeah, but anyway, I don't want to take too much time. But that's all I was saying, that there has been a completed melacha, and then something additional happens.
Like, let me have a look, and then we'll take this off group. I'll try and have a look again at the movie. Okay, so that's I think a summary of makabel patish. I wanted to mention one other thing maybe, which I could have mentioned there earlier, which is I did print, I think, in the first source sheet the Baal Hamar's list of the chatos that you're chayiv, and he goes basically like Rashi, except he makes one alteration, in which he learns that the melachot is of choresh is the melachot over here, and he substitutes that for tochen. Now, there's two questions over here. How can there be a melachot of choresh, and why is there no melachot of tochen? As to how there's the melachot of choresh, Rashi says the reason there's no choresh over here is because you're tzorech la'afra. You need the earth for the clay to make the chovis, to make the pitcher or the barrel, but you don't need the hole in the ground. And this reminds us of the sugya on Ein Gimel on his base, that chofer v'tzorech la'afra, if you dig a hole and you're not doing it in order to improve the ground, but you're doing it in order to get the earth out, your potter, because it's makalkan in the ground, and various other explanations that this is really the discussion of the Gemara, whether it's malacha shein tzrich legufa, etc. So Rashi argues that you wouldn't be chayiv over here for the malacha of choresh because of chafira, because the chafira is done in order to get the earth rather than to create a hole in the ground. The Rabbeinu Chanan, the Balamam, learns that no, he says this is talking about a situation where you are chayfer the tzorich leguma, so you need both the ofra and the hole, and therefore you're chayiv for this. Now in Londus this is very difficult, because it may be true that you happen to be chayfer in order to get the earth out, and also you need the hole, and therefore you're also chayiv for choresh. But it's difficult to argue that this is a chatos, a malacha, that's intrinsically connected to the process of pitcher production. The whole point of the Gemara is it's trying to explain how many melachos are involved in creating the tanur, or in creating the chovis. Here you need the earth of the chovis, and it happens to be that you're doing two in one, because you're also quite pleased to make that little hole in the ground in order to improve the ground. So it's difficult that the Balamar counts as malacha. It seems to be extraneous to the genuine production of the chovis. So that's point one. Point two is, why does the Balamar not list tochen? And this is why I said maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, because I think this ties up to the previous discussion. There's a number of answers one can give why tochen is not relevant, but possibly the simplest answer of it is that the Balamar holds that there is no tochen with earth because it's not gedolei karka. And if you remember, we discussed this when we learned tochen. The tochen mainly be gedolei karka. We then said the svara of Rabbi Kiva Eiga, that if you're chayiv on things that grow from the ground, then kal v'chomer you're chayiv for the ground itself. It could be that the Balamar held that techina is not relevant over here, and therefore you wouldn't be chayiv in the melacha of tochen, and therefore you had to learn the melacha of choresh. An alternative is that he doesn't believe that crumbling earth is relevant to the melacha of tochen at all. Tochen is when you have a solid and you grind it, like a grain of wheat, which you grind into flour. When you crumble earth, that's not melacha of tochen at all. When you crumble earth, the particles are attached very loosely, and they're not really a solid which you're converting into a powder. It's simply a loose adhesion of powder, which you then just crumble and the powder is restored. And maybe the Balamar holds that this isn't tochen. Tochen is when you are crumbling into lots of pieces, something which is one piece, not where you have something which is crumbly and you're just actually crumbling it up. So again, as I mentioned, this is our sugya is really just a little bit of a tour of lots of melachos. So it's a chazorah on some of the ideas that we discussed when we learnt the melacha of tochen.
Is it the same question then? You could say maybe later we'll come on to it that the mavir also is not necessarily intrinsic to the process, because you could have it already lit beforehand.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. In one of the Shonim, I think, makes this point explicitly.
No, Rashi specifically says that it's his walking along. He will increase. He will whiten the fire by walking. The fire's there already, but he's walking along with it to put it where it should be.
Yeah, I think I printed in the source sheets the Ritva, and our other Rishonim also who say this point. The Ritva takes out the melacha of mavir, lighting the fire, because he says that mavir is not essential to the melacha of the creation of the tanur. You could have a fire which is already lit, a kiln which is already lit, and then you bake the chavis inside this kiln, and therefore it's not essential to the process. But I would say this is less of a question than the Baal Hamor. At the end of the day, if I ask you how many melachos are involved in baking a pitcher, in manufacturing a pitcher, it's legitimate to say that one of the melachos is lighting the fire in order to bake it in the kiln. It could be I happen to have a kiln already lit, fair enough, but one of the melachos is lighting that fire. So the Ritva says, no, since you could do it without the fire, I don't believe this should be in the list. You can hear the counter argument that this is fundamental to the production process, which is having a kiln to bake it in. The question I'm asking on the Baal Hamor is more fundamental, because the fact that I'm chorish the ground really has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the pitcher. In no way is it connected to the production of the pitcher. The production of the pitcher is producing earth, which I use. Look, you could ask the same question on earth. Maybe I've already got a supply of clay, and therefore don't list that amongst the melachas. The answer is we're not talking about a particular story. Of course, someone could buy in clay, and then there wouldn't be the melacha of clay manufacture. You could buy a ready-made pitcher, and then there would be no melachas at all. We're talking about if you go from 0 to full, how many melachas are involved in the producing of a pitcher. And therefore, it's legitimate to list lighting the fire. We're not going to take into account things which are already there preceding the process. Whereas the Baal Hamor, in which he says you are extracting the earth from the ground, and therefore that's the melacha of choresh, because it's improving the ground at the same time, that appears to be very difficult, because that really is extraneous. It's not at all a necessary step in the production of clay utensils.
Yeah, but could I ask then, but the Rabbeinu Hananel, though, lists both choresh and tochen, because I think he understands it differently, doesn't he? Because he has a pile which you smooth. So I'm
going to put you on hold, because we'll talk. I don't want to go out in order. We'll talk about Rabbeinu Hananel shortly. Just try and work through all of them. But for now, since you mentioned it, that's why I mentioned the Ritva, which is my question on the Baal Hamor. How can the Baal Hamor list choresh? Seems to me a much stronger question than any of the others on the list. You can quibble with others on the list and argue, is lighting the fire part of the process or not? But you can hear the logic of Rashi, who says lighting the fire is part of the process. And the Ritva says, look, maybe you've already got a ready lit fire. But the Baal Hamor, seems to me it's a very, very strong question. It's a problem on the Baal Hamor. Why is the fact that I happen to also be improving the ground, in what way has that got anything to do with the production process? And I don't really know an answer to that question. It's completely incidental to the production of the clay vessel that happens to be there. When I extract the earth from the ground, I'm also improving the ground. It just seems to be no connection whatsoever. Okay, so this is the list of Rishonim in the Melacha. Since Adam mentioned Rabbeinu Hananel, we'll talk now about Rabbeinu Hananel's list, and then I want to go and talk about Tosas's list, because of course Tosas introduces Boina, and that introduces the issue of whether there is Boina or not. So just very briefly, if we run through Rabbeinu Hananel's list, Rabbeinu Hananel's list is Choresh, in which case you would have to say like something like the Baal Hamor, that somehow you're improving the ground, except he gives a different way of improving the ground. The Baal Hamor says you're improving the ground by digging the hole in the ground. The Rabbeinu Hananel seems to say that you have a gavshushis, a mound, and by removing it, you're leaving a smooth earth there, and therefore the ground is being improved by leaving the smooth earth there. If you remember again the Gemara on Ein Gimel base, we spoke about two ways through which removing earth can improve the ground, either by digging a hole and it creates a little structure in the ground or something like that, or by removing a little mound and therefore smoothing the ground, and Rabbeinu Chananel adopts the second one. Then he says Toichen, which is like Rashi. And others here, he's on the side of Rashi against the Balamor. He believes that Toichen does apply. He says Boireh, he says Mechatich. He says Boineh, which is like Tosus, which we'll get onto soon, whether there is Boin or not. And then he says Makib Patish. And he considers Makib Patish to be one of the melachos. Now, he doesn't, 2 points over here. The first point is that the question that Rashi said, that the argument, that Rashi put forward, that Makib Patish should not apply in this melacha, would not be a question of Rabbeinu Chananel. Because Rashi's point was, Makib Patish should be intrinsic to the baking process. Surely the baking process is a completion of the utensil, and that should be Makib Patish. And that Rashi said, baking is indirect, I don't do it myself. Whereas Rabbeinu Chananel says that at the end of making it, you smooth off the sides of the pitcher, and that's Makib Patish, and that's a classic Makib Patish. It's a unique and specific action of completing it by smoothing it off, and that's a direct action in the body of the pitcher and the guf of the chavis, rather than doing something in the oven, and therefore that would be good that he lists this as Makib Patish. He doesn't tell us what his seventh malacha is. There's a little bit of a Gersa confusion in the Rabbeinu Chananel, in which the version we have something that's become corrupted, and we don't know what the seventh malacha in Rabbeinu Chananel is. So this is the view of Rabbeinu Chananel. Adam, did you want to say something about the shit of Rabbeinu Chananel, or is what I've said, or does that answer it? Yeah. Okay, so this is Rabbeinu Chananel. But what I wanted to spend the remaining time available to us today speaking about, before we try and finish off the sugya in the next year, and we talk about Abaya's statement of Haiman Ovid Chalsa Chayv Achas Esrei Chatos, the 11 chatos that Abaya list. But for the purposes of our sugya, which is the Chovis and the Tanur, is the issue of Binyan Bekalim, whether Yesh Binyan Bekalim or Ein Binyan Bekalim. And those of you who have learnt Halacha Shabbos will be aware that this is an important topic in practical Halacha also, whether the melacha of Boineh applies with utensils or not. In other words, again, we're doing a little tour of the melachas. We will learn in more detail all the melachas as we work through them one by one. But for now, a general conceptual question. Is Boineh only when I set up and build a structure which is not a keli, it's a structure which has defines space and area, and encloses or acts as a barrier or whatever it may be for defining a space? Or is it even constructing a keli in which I bring something into functional existence by attaching parts, which is what would appear to be the melachah of Boineh, even when what I'm making is a function, a functionality, a keli, rather than a structure in space. So Rashi assumes that there's ein binyan b'keli, and the melacha of Boineh wouldn't make sense when I'm making keli, and therefore the melacha of Boineh is not applicable here when I'm making the picture. Tosfos, after he brings Rashi, he's choylek on Rashi, and he brings a series of questions. And just very briefly to summarize the questions, one case is he talks about a portable bed where I click the parts of the bed into place in order to make a bed. The other is a menorah made of chulias, a menorah made of lots of joins, and I slot in all the different joins and beams in order to make parts to make a menorah. He then references a Gemara of someone who puts the handle of a trowel or a shovel or something, or a spade, into the spade itself, and puts the sort of handle into the spade itself, and he says there would be Boineh. And then he talks about I think he also references blowing. Does he reference blowing glass? Yes, and blowing glass and making a glass utensil again. Whether there would be Boineh there. So Tosfos is of the view that yesh binyan b'kelim. I think in the sheets that I gave out, I also printed the view of the Rambam, and the Rambam also paskins that yesh, the Rambam Perik Yud Halach Yud Gimel on the sheets that I gave out. The Rambam says Chena Oisek Kli Adama Kagon Tanur v'Chovis Kodem Sheyisrafu. How is that told us Boineh v'Chayev? So Rambam learns that that binyan bekalim is a tolda of boina, and you would be chayiv for binyan bekalim. And in the Noisei Kalim, the Magen Mishnah references our Gemara, and he says, what's the source for the Rambam's idea that there's binyan bekalim? And he quotes Abaya, Abaya, Haiman David Chavisa Chayiv Zayin Chatois, Tanura Chayiv Ches Chatois, the Echon Mehem who Habayna, and he brings this as the view of the Yerushalmi, and he brings that this is the view of the Gaonim also. And the Kesef Mishnah on the Gemara brings the Sefer Uraim, who's from the Re'aim, from Rabbi Zobin Metz, one of the German Bali Tosfos, who argues, and he holds the Ein Binyan Bekalim, which is like the view of Rashi, and he also brings proofs for this. So it ends up being a significant machlokes rishonim. We have the Rambam and Tosfos on one side, we have the Rashi and the Uraim on the other side, and I printed all of these in the source sheet. Our guy's Maimonides, who was an Ashkenazi Talmud of the Bali Tosfos, but who wrote a sort of connecting work, a bridging work on the Rambam, linking the views of the Rambam to the views of the Ashkenazi Rishonim. He points out there on the Rambam also, or Deloi Karashi, Shapir Shasam, Haiman David Chavisa, etc., against the view of Rashi. So we have here a Machlokes Rishonim, basically, whether Yesh Binyan Bekalim or Ein Binyan Bekalim, as I just said. Now, the Balamor and the Tosfos Rid and the Ritva and so on, I printed all their views around this issue. But I just wanted to use the time available to speak about what Rashi would do with the questions of Tosfos, the rise of Tosfos. How can Rashi maintain that Ein Binyan Bekalim after having seen all the rise of Tosfos? So I don't know if anyone managed to have a look at the various sources that I put there, but basically it would appear that there are three answers to how we understand Rashi's view. One answer, which is the Hagahos Maimonides, which I just referenced. The Hagahos Maimonides says that that if you look at the Hagahos Maimonides, basically the Hagahos Maimonides says that the quote that Tosfos says is Lav Dafka. When the Gemara references a statement of Rav that says when you put the handle into the utensil, you're chayiv mishum boina, what he's saying is that it isn't the melacha. He's coming to argue on Shmuel in that Gemara over there, and he's saying that against Shmuel holds it's makeh b'patish. In other words, Shmuel argues that there's the melacha of makeh b'patish because I'm completing the utensil. Says Rav, this isn't makeh b'patish because I'm merely joining two pieces together, and therefore what's taking place is boina. And therefore the relevant malacha that you ought to think about would be boina. But in practice, boina is also not a malacha because ein binyan bekalim. In other words, what's happening is an act of binyan, an act of joining pieces together. It's not an act of completing something. Rav is arguing Shmuel and says the relevant malacha is not makeh b'patish. What malacha is it? In principle, the malacha you would have to think about would be boina. But in practice, it's not boina because ein binyan bekalim. In other words, Hagahos Maimonides' svara seems to be that the reason why ein binyan bekalim is because they're not chashuv enough. It's not that you can't describe what's taking place when I'm attaching two pieces together as boina. What's taking place is boina. Therefore, the malacha can't be makeh b'patish. However, since it's only a keli, it's only a utensil, it's not a more permanent structure. Therefore, I wouldn't be chayev for boina, even though what I've done is an act of building. So putting things together for kalim, according to Hagahos Maimonides, would be an act of building, but not an act of building that has enough chashivas to make me chayev on. And this would be one way of understanding the view of Rashi. This is the view of the Hagahos Maimonides. The Vilna Gaon, who I quote on the Shulchan Aruch, addresses this issue also in the Biur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not going to go fully into the answer of the Vilna Gaon, but the Vilna Gaon learns that this is in truth a machlokas amoraim, and it is true to say that Rav holds that yesh binyan bekalim, but that's because Rav holds like Abaya elsewhere, who also holds yesh binyan bekalim, whereas we paskin like Rava, who says ein binyan bekalim, and therefore the halacha is ein binyan bekalim, and la halacha. What Rashi says that there's no binyan bekalim is really getting caught up in a machlokas amoraim, and la halacha we paskin ein binyan bekalim. There's no binyan bekalim. The answer I particularly wanted to look at was the answer to Pnei Yeshua, because the Pnei Yeshua brings us back to some of the previous melachos that we spoke about before, And the Bnei Yeshua seems to say that even Rashi would agree that if you make a keli from nothing, if you make a complete keli, you would be chayav because of boina. And the reason why our scenario of chavis and tanur, chalsa is different is because their melacha is not done through any one particular melacha. You need a number of stages in order to create it, and therefore, until each stage is done, there's no, it's not becoming fit for purpose. And therefore, boina is only when through attaching the pieces together, something new is created with a new functionality. However, with these things, when the boina occurs and I'm attaching the pieces together in order to mold my clay utensil, at this point in time, it still doesn't have any functionality because there's a number of other steps that are needed in order to now make it into utensil, not least baking it in the kiln. And therefore, the concept of boina only makes sense in kalim when through attaching pieces together, I now bring something new of functionality into existence, and that would be the melacha of boina. If, when I attach pieces together, no new functionality comes into existence, then this isn't the melacha of boina. I'll just give one example of where this svara is used in somewhat in Halacha L'Maisa. And this is the very famous discussion around the use of electricity on Shabbos. The Chazon Ish was convinced that the melacha of boina would apply to switching on electricity on Shabbos because I'm creating a circuit, and through moving these pieces into a new positioning them together, a new functionality is coming into existence, which is that the circuit is live and is able to conduct a current and therefore serves a purpose. And therefore he believed that this would be the melacha of boina. However, if the electricity is off, for example, if my time switch is off, and I know the time switch is going to come on in half an hour, and when the time switch comes on, it will turn the light on in my bedroom, for example, and I want to be able to go to sleep and not have the light in my bedroom, then the Chazon Ish would agree that I can turn the light switch off in the meantime because I'm doing nothing. In other words, while the time switch is off, as I flip the switch, I'm not doing anything at all. It's off before I flip the switch and it's off after I flip the switch. It is true that when the time switch now comes on, the light will not turn on, even though beforehand it was going to turn on. Now, one may ask, but at this point, I'm still flipping the switch. And even though the time switch is off, I'm still moving the pieces around. Nonetheless, there wouldn't be the melacha of boina because no new functionality is created through that because the current isn't flowing. If I do it the other way around, where I turn the switch on, and therefore when the time switch comes on, the light will now go on, then that's the world of groma. Now that the time switch comes on, I've caused the light to go on through my action, and therefore that would be asa. If I'm turning the light off, in other words, it was due to come on and I'm merely stopping it going on, there everyone would agree with that it's mutter. What about the argument that creating a circuit is boina? The answer is yes, but not when I create a circuit, when the time switch is off and no new functionality is coming into existence. So you see this sort of logic of the Bnei Yeshua even translating into practical halacha. Again, this is a little bit of a tour of many melachas, which our sugya forces us into, and therefore there's just a couple of ha'oros on the melacha of boina. I'll stop there because I've run out of time, and Emir Hashem on next Tuesday we will have our final share before Sukkot, when I'll try and say a few points on the 11 melachas of the next sugya, and I'll put my own comments on the sheets and try and give some direction on the WhatsApp group and try and give some direction about what we'll focus on. And then after Sukkot, hopefully we'll go back to more our normal style of learning, in which we'll be learning melachas more be'ir and trying to understand properly and in depth what each melacha is. But I'll take this opportunity to wish those of you that I won't see before Rosh Hashanah, over Rosh Hashanah, to wish you a Shana Tova. Should be Ksivach Sima Tova. It should be a bracha for all of us. And thank you so much for being part of this very chashuv group.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can only hope for your bracha.
Amen. Good night.